The early hours of November 27, 2024, brought a wave of relief across Lebanon and Israel. The dawn of a new day seemed to carry with it the promise of peace, a fragile hope that had been absent for far too long. As the sun rose, it cast a golden hue over the war-torn landscapes, symbolizing a new beginning, however uncertain it might be. A ceasefire, brokered after weeks of devastating conflict, finally came into effect. The negotiations had been arduous, with both sides making significant concessions to reach this point. The world watched with bated breath as leaders from both nations shook hands, a gesture that carried the weight of countless lives lost and futures altered. Fireworks lit up the night sky in Beirut, a stark contrast to the missile trails that had become a grimly familiar sight. The explosions of color were a temporary distraction from the harsh realities on the ground, a momentary escape from the fear and uncertainty that had gripped the region for so long. Yet, beneath the surface of celebration, a deep unease lingered. The people of Beirut, while hopeful, were acutely aware of the fragility of this newfound peace. Their expressions, a mix of relief and apprehension, told a story of resilience and cautious optimism. The streets, though filled with celebratory sounds, also echoed with the silent prayers for a lasting peace. The ceasefire, while welcomed, felt tenuous, a temporary pause in a conflict far from resolved. Soldiers stood down, their weapons momentarily silent, but the tension in the air was palpable. The ceasefire was a delicate balance, a fragile truce that could be shattered by the slightest provocation. The scars of war ran deep. Buildings that once stood tall were now reduced to rubble, a stark reminder of the destruction that had swept through the region. People navigated through the debris, their faces etched with the pain of loss and the determination to rebuild. Across southern Lebanon, entire neighborhoods lay in ruins, testaments to the ferocity of the fighting. The landscape, once vibrant and full of life, now resembled a war zone, with crumbling structures and deserted streets. The devastation was a stark reminder of the cost of conflict, a visual representation of the suffering endured by countless families. Thousands of homes were reduced to rubble, their former inhabitants scattered, seeking refuge in a land struggling to accommodate them. Refugee camps sprang up, makeshift shelters providing a semblance of safety for those who had lost everything. The camps, though a refuge, were a stark reminder of the ongoing humanitarian crisis, a testament to the resilience of those who had been displaced. The road to recovery promised to be long and arduous. Aid workers tirelessly distributed supplies, providing much-needed relief to those in need. Rebuilding efforts began, but the scale of the destruction meant that progress would be slow. The journey ahead was daunting, but the spirit of the people remained unbroken. The ceasefire marked not an end, but a beginning of the daunting task of rebuilding shattered lives and a shattered nation. Families began to return to their homes or what was left of them, determined to reclaim their lives and rebuild their communities. The handshake that symbolized peace was just the first step in a long journey towards healing and reconciliation, a beginning of the daunting task of rebuilding shattered lives and a shattered nation. Communities came together, united in their efforts to rebuild. Construction workers labored tirelessly, and community cleanup efforts were in full swing. The road ahead was fraught with challenges, but the collective will to rebuild provided a glimmer of hope. It marked the start of a fragile peace, its endurance uncertain, its success dependent on a multitude of internal and external factors. Peace rallies and protests called for a lasting resolution, while United Nations peacekeeping forces worked to maintain stability. The future was uncertain, but the hope for a lasting peace remained strong, a beacon of light in a region long shrouded in darkness. The ceasefire triggered a mass movement of people eager to return to their homes, to reclaim a semblance of normalcy. The roads, once deserted and dangerous, were now filled with a steady stream of cars and trucks, each carrying families with a glimmer of hope in their eyes. They were determined to rebuild their lives despite the uncertainty that lay ahead. Families who had spent weeks crammed into overcrowded shelters or relying on the hospitality of relatives packed their meager belongings. The shelters, once a temporary refuge, had become a place of shared stories and collective grief. Now, as they prepared to leave, there was a mix of relief and anxiety. The journey ahead was fraught with challenges, but the promise of home kept them moving forward. They journeyed back to villages and towns bearing the brunt of the conflict. The roads were littered with remnants of war, a stark reminder of the battles that had raged. As they approached their destinations, the reality of the destruction became more apparent. The once familiar landscapes were now unrecognizable, scarred by the violence that had torn through them, but the homecoming was bittersweet. The joy of returning was overshadowed by the devastation that greeted them. Homes that had once been filled with laughter and memories were now reduced to rubble. The emotional toll was immense as families grappled with the loss of their past and the uncertainty of their future. Many arrived to find their homes uninhabitable, reduced to piles of rubble and twisted metal. The destruction was overwhelming, and the task of rebuilding seemed insurmountable. Yet, amidst the ruins there was a sense of resilience. People began to clear the debris, determined to reclaim their lives one brick at a time. The stench of explosives lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the violence that had swept through their lives. The sounds of war had been replaced by the quiet determination of those who had returned. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and dust, but also with the resolve to rebuild and move forward. The lucky ones found refuge with relatives whose homes were still standing, adding to the already heavy burden on families struggling to cope. These homes, though damaged, became sanctuaries where stories of survival were shared and plans for the future were made. The sense of community grew stronger as people leaned on each other for support and strength. The return of the displaced was just the beginning of a long and arduous journey. The road to recovery was filled with obstacles, but the spirit of the people remained unbroken. They navigated through the destroyed areas, finding solace in the small victories and the progress they made each day. The physical and emotional scars ran deep, and the challenges of rebuilding their lives seemed insurmountable. Yet, amidst the tears and the pain, there was a glimmer of hope. The community came together, offering support and resources to those in need. The journey was difficult, but they were not alone. The true cost of the conflict, both in human and material terms, was only beginning to reveal itself. The landscape was forever changed, but the spirit of the people remained resilient. As they stood amidst the ruins, they knew that the road ahead was long, but they were determined to rebuild and create a new future for themselves and their children. Southern Lebanon, once a region of bustling towns and fertile farmlands, now resembled a desolate wasteland. The scale of the destruction was staggering. Homes, schools, hospitals, and vital infrastructure lay in ruins. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of smoke, a constant reminder of the devastation. Initial efforts focused on clearing the rubble and debris, a Herculean task given the sheer scale of the destruction. International aid organizations arrived, bringing with them much-needed supplies and expertise. But the task of rebuilding was daunting, complicated by Lebanon's pre-existing economic woes. The World Bank estimated the cost of reconstruction at a staggering $8.5 billion, a figure dwarfing Lebanon's already strained resources. The international community pledged support, but it remained to be seen whether these pledges would translate into concrete action. Section 4. Hezbollah's reckoning, a shadow of its former self. Hezbollah, once a dominant force in Lebanon, emerged from the conflict battered and weakened. While they claimed victory, the cost of their defiance was substantial. Their leadership had been decimated, their military capabilities severely degraded. The group's ability to project power, both domestically and regionally, had been significantly diminished. The question on many minds was whether Hezbollah could maintain its grip on power. The group's political capital, once seemingly limitless, had been eroded by the devastation inflicted upon the country. Their ability to provide for their constituents, a key source of their legitimacy, was now in question. Hezbollah's future role in Lebanon remained uncertain. The group faced a crossroads, forced to choose between clinging to their paramilitary past or embracing a more political future. The choices they made would have profound implications for the future of Lebanon. Section 5. The Lebanese Army, a force in need of reinforcements. The ceasefire agreement called for the deployment of 5,000 Lebanese army troops to the south, tasked with maintaining order and securing the border. This was a monumental task, given the volatile nature of the region and the complex dynamics at play. The soldiers were expected to not only maintain peace, but also to act as a buffer between various factions, a role that required both strategic acumen and robust resources. However, the army, long underfunded and lacking in resources, was ill-equipped for such a challenge. Their equipment was outdated, their vehicles were often in disrepair, and the soldiers themselves were visibly weary from years of underfunding and neglect. The lack of modern technology and adequate supplies severely hampered their operational capabilities. Their ability to assert control over the region, particularly in the face of Hezbollah's continued presence, was questionable. Hezbollah, with its well-trained fighters and advanced weaponry, posed a significant challenge to the Lebanese army. The soldiers found themselves in a tense standoff, often outgunned and outmaneuvered by the more experienced and better-equipped militias. The army's struggles were emblematic of the larger challenges facing Lebanon. The country was grappling with widespread infrastructure decay, economic instability, and a lack of effective governance. The soldiers patrolled through dilapidated areas, their presence a stark reminder of the state's inability to maintain even basic public services. Years of corruption and mismanagement had hollowed out the state, leaving it unable to provide even basic services to its citizens. Government buildings lay abandoned, infrastructure crumbled, and citizens struggled to get by in rundown areas. The systemic issues were deep-rooted, and the impact was felt across all sectors of society. The army's plight was a stark reminder of the need for fundamental reform and a rebuilding of state institutions. Training facilities were inadequate, equipment was in disrepair, and soldiers often had to make do with makeshift barracks. The need for comprehensive reform was urgent, and the rebuilding of state institutions was essential for the country's stability and progress. The international community, recognizing the army's limitations, pledged support and training. UN personnel and international military advisors worked closely with the Lebanese soldiers, providing much-needed aid packages and training programs. This external support was crucial, but it was clear that a long-term commitment was necessary to bring about meaningful change. However, transforming the Lebanese army into a capable and professional force would require a sustained commitment and a significant investment of resources. Advanced training programs and new military gear were steps in the right direction, but the road ahead was long and fraught with challenges. The future of the Lebanese army, and indeed the country, depended on the collective efforts of both domestic and international stakeholders to rebuild and reform the institutions that were the backbone of the state. Section 6. Ticking Time Bomb. The ceasefire's precarious hold. While the guns had fallen silent, a palpable sense of unease lingered. The ceasefire, while welcomed, felt tenuous, a temporary reprieve in a conflict far from over. The underlying tensions that had sparked the conflict remained unresolved. Any misstep, any miscalculation, had the potential to reignite the conflict. Both sides remained wary, their fingers hovering over the trigger. Israel, while welcoming the ceasefire, vowed to respond forcefully to any future attacks. Hezbollah, licking its wounds but defiant, insisted on its right to resist Israeli occupation. The potential for miscalculation and escalation loomed large. The ceasefire was a fragile construct dependent on a complex web of internal and external factors. Maintaining this fragile peace would require restraint, diplomacy, and a commitment from all parties to finding a lasting solution.